hang on. Okay. Okay, this is one of the uh, regulation under Factories and Machinery Act. It being called Factories and Machineries Lead Regulation 1984. So, um, to protect the workers from hazards, and then this regulation be imposed to take care of our fellow worker when they work at hazard with the lead hazards. So factories, industrial, who are involved in lead have to comply with these regulations. So the purpose of this regulation is to prevent occupational disease due to usage and exposure of lead at the workplace. This regulation also um, to come out with minimum exposure of the lead with this there is a standard uh, that fellow worker able to be exposed. They call it minimum exposure standard. Yeah? So there is two purpose for this regulations. So what are the regulation being applied for? So actually the factories that the lead being used is being applied. They have to comply with this regulation. So except at the construction site or works of engineering. So is so all industry or all factories that involve a work process that using lead have to comply with this regulation. So in this regulation also, they said if there is a construction site, so construction site or works of engineering that using lead, they're not been under these regulations. So before we furthermore discuss on the regulation, we need to understand the physical properties of the lead. Yeah? Lead, sometimes they call it lead. Yeah? In Malaysia, we call it lead. Yeah? Or lead from Australia, they call it lead. Yeah? It's a silver bluish white. Yeah? It's silver bluish white. It's like a silver, silver. Silver car. If you drive car, the color is silver. More likely is lead. There is a content of the lead. So the properties is more on silver, bluish, white, and it's a heavy metal. And melting point 327 degrees Celsius. So if you want to melt the lead, the temperature will be at 327 degrees Celsius. So activity such as uh, plating, um, they want to they want to join the iron. They're using lead, this lead, and this lead or lead will vaporize more than 506 degrees. I mean vaporize, dia menjadi uap, bila dalam keadaan more than 500 degrees, it will be vaporized. Dia akan menjadi uap dan dia akan dilepaskan di udara. It can be in form of inorganic and also organic. So there is a two formation of this lead, which is inorganic or organic. So, for example, last time in our petrol, right? In our petrol station, they're using lead. This lead is very dangerous for our for human being. That's why they substitute the petrol using unleaded lead, eh? Or unleaded lead. So uh, the activities that involve in using lead is battery, cable, plastic, plastic, cat, orang yang buat cat apa sapu cat dinding sebagainya tu, dia guna lead, welding tu yang nak cakap tadi, welding and soldering. So this is using lead or lead, melting or containing lead, there is a process of the melting iron. They're using lead also. If the factory involved in process of ceramic and glass, also they're using lead. So what are the health effects if the human being or the worker consume this lead? So workers will suffer anemia. Anemia is that they're losing red blood cells. The anemia means that the reduction of the red blood cells. So if they consume this lead will kill the red blood cells. They so become anemic. And in fact, the nervous system, our nervous system will be affected if they consume, they inhale this lead. And teratogen. Teratogen is more on cancer. Cancer, they call it teratogen. Cancer to the female productivity. So they call it teratogen, cancer. So this is very hazardous and dangerous to human being. So this called this lead. When we exposed to this activity of the industry that involve this activity. So there is, if you want to know better about this lead, I will show you in this YouTube the activity of using lead. So we can pay attention with this lead industry.
In 1978, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration issued 29 CFR 1910.1025, a comprehensive standard designed to protect workers in general industry from the harmful effects of lead overexposure. This standard, however, did not apply to the construction industry. In 1993, OSHA issued 29 CFR 1926.62, the interim final rule for lead exposure in construction. This standard extends the same protection provided by the general industry standard to workers in the construction industry. The construction and general industry standards are very similar. Most of the differences between the two are a result of the unique nature of some construction work. tasks of short durations with the potential for high lead exposure levels. This program will provide information dealing with both lead regulations, paying special attention to the construction industry standard. Lead is a toxic substance. Long-term overexposure to lead can cause serious damage to several body systems. It can even be deadly when absorbed in large amounts. Breathing airborne lead dust and fumes is the most common way that lead enters the body. Lead dust can also be ingested if it comes into contact with the mouth. Once absorbed into the body, lead collects in the bloodstream, bones, and other tissues where it will remain for several years. Overexposure to lead can either be long-term, where small amounts accumulate in the body over time, or acute, where large amounts are absorbed in a short period of time. The health effects of long-term overexposure to lead can include damage to your blood, kidneys, nervous system, and reproductive system. Common symptoms of long-term overexposure include a metallic taste in the mouth, loss of appetite, nausea, constipation, headache, and dizziness. Other symptoms include anxiety, insomnia, hyperactivity, excessive tiredness, weakness, and pain or soreness in muscles and joints. The major health effect of acute overexposure, exposure to very large amounts of lead in a short period of time, is encephalopathy. This condition affects the brain and can cause seizures, coma, and even death in a matter of days. Symptoms of acute overexposure include a feeling of dullness, drowsiness, grogginess, poor memory, restlessness, irritability, tremors, convulsions, and vomiting. Workplace exposures to deadly amounts of lead are highly unusual, but not impossible. Because of the harmful effects of lead, OSHA has set a permissible exposure limit, or PEL, of 50 micrograms of lead per cubic meter of air. The PEL is the maximum amount of airborne lead that workers are permitted to be exposed to over an 8-hour day. OSHA has also set an action level of 30 micrograms per cubic meter. The action level, which is lower than the PEL, is the airborne lead concentration at which an employer is required to take action by providing training and taking certain precautionary measures. As a part of the mandatory training program, you will receive instruction in the content of the OSHA lead standard and its appendices, the types of jobs in your workplace that could result in exposure to lead, the health hazards associated with lead exposure, and the contents of the written compliance or exposure control plan used by your employer. Your employer will also make you aware of the engineering and work practice controls used to limit your exposure to lead, the purpose, proper selection, fitting, use, and limitations of respirators, the cleaning practices and facilities you should use to minimize contamination, and the purpose of your company's medical surveillance program and medical protection benefits program. Your employer must provide this information and training prior to any new job assignment involving lead. All training materials and information will be made available to you upon request at any time. OSHA has set procedures for employers to assess the exposure risks to workers and measure the airborne lead concentrations in the workplace. Anytime you begin a new operation or task, your employer must determine if you could be exposed to lead at or above the action level. This exposure assessment is usually based on previous air monitoring results or accepted industry standards. If it is determined that you could be exposed to lead at or above the action level, then your employer will conduct what is known as initial air monitoring. Air samples will be collected from your work area over a full 8-hour work shift. These samples will be tested to determine the airborne lead concentration. As we said, in the construction industry, some tasks are very short in duration, with the potential for exposure to high concentrations of airborne lead. Unless properly protected, workers could easily be exposed to damaging lead levels before the results of the air monitoring tests come back from the lab. For this reason, the construction industry standard requires employers to provide workers with protection during this determination period. This comes in the form of protective clothing, respirators, and other personal protective equipment. To assure that the appropriate amount of protection is provided, OSHA has divided all construction tasks into 3 categories based on their potential airborne lead concentrations. Each
Alright, so understand lead ni is hazardous to health. You tengok tadi industri yang bekerja mengecat pun. Kadang kita bila kita rumah kita dicat bau dia tak boleh tahan. You tak boleh duduk dekat rumah tu kurang-kurangnya seminggu. Sebab dia ada element of lead dalam cat tu. So protection and surveillance have to be done. So this is we're talking about lead. Tadi video tu menunjukkan aktiviti lead. So in this regulation, there is a salient provision. Salient provision is mean under this regulation there is a provision. One is the permissible exposure limit. And as you've seen in the YouTube just now, there is a permissible exposure limit based on the airborne concentration. So under this regulation, they spell out what are the quantum, what are the quantity that can be exposed. And then there is exposure monitoring. So they have to monitor the exposure and methods of compliance. So what are the things that need to be complied with this regulation? And then there is a respiratory protection, of course, because it is involved in inhaling. Human being inhale these hazardous lead. And there is also protective work clothing and equipment and housekeeping. So another of the provision in this regulation, they spell out about the hygiene facilities and practice. The place must be hygienic. And then medical surveillance, they have to do medical surveillance, and also medical removal protection. So under medical removal protection, certain workers will be removed from working in this area. And also there is also employee information and training. They have to have information for the employee and also training to the employee. And there is a signs and also record keeping. Sign is to highlight that the place is a hazardous place to enter, and precaution have to take into consideration. And also there is a record keeping because this lead is it can be acute if you inhale as a large amount, but if you inhale a small quantity amount, it will be a chronic. It will be chronic case if you slowly accumulate the quantity in the long term. That's why they have this record keeping. So in this lab, what are the regulations of what are the standard in terms of the permissible exposure limit? Permissible exposure limit is 150 microgram per cubic meter, average 8 hours. So when people working at office hours, 8 hours, so the average airborne concentration at our that place, at the workplace, should be not more than 150 microgram. And action level 75 microgram per cubic meter average 8 hours. So action level, they have to comply the method of compliance. So what they need to do, for example, they have to use PPE, they have to do housekeeping. This is action level. You see this, the content is below the 150, which is 75 microgram per cubic meter. Yeah? If the working hour is not 8 hour, then permissible exposure limit is 1,200 per hours work in the day for the day. So if they work at shift hours, for example, eh, the content should be not more than 1,200. For example, they spend 1 hour over there. At any time, the permissible exposure limit shouldn't be 1,200 microgram per cubic meter per hours. Yeah. So in terms of exposure monitoring, uh, the employer have to determine if any employee may be exposed to lead at or above the action level. So they have to, you see at the video, they have a gadget to measure the exposure of the employee, and then they have to collect full shift for at least 7 continuous hours personal samples, as we highlight in the video. There is equipment that able to measure the lead content. So they have to collect personal samples. So individual who work at this lab, they have to collect their sample individually, at least 7 continuous hours. So if they're working 8 hours or more than 8 hours, they have to measure at least seven continuous hours. And then at least one sample for each shift, uh, for each job classification in each work area. So they have to collect one sample for each shift. So if they work after office hours at morning, so at least one sample. And then full shift personal sample shall be representative of the monitored employer regular daily exposure to it. So full shift personnel, when they work daily, daily, um, so they have to monitor if the employee work every day, uh, Monday to Friday. So they have to collect the sample. So when talk about exposure monitoring, they have to do initial determination. Initial determination is monitoring for the initial determination may be limited to a representative sample of the exposed employee who the employer reasonably believes is exposed to the greatest airborne concentration of lead in the workplace. So the initial determination is a representative sample, representative sample of the employer who been exposed, and employer who been exposed, who's been the exposed greatest airborne. So for example, this worker working at site A, B, and they found that site A is the most activity that using lead. So this workers working at the greatest airborne concentration of lead is the sample that they want to do initial determination. So they have to conduct employee exposure monitoring if the initial determination more than action level. eh. So just now I mentioned the action level is hang on, action level 75 microgram per cubic meter. So initial determination must, if they more than 75, sorry, 75 micro cubic meter, they have to determine the employee. And the exposure more than action level or below permissible exposure level, so at least every 6 months. So they have to do initial determination if the exposure more than 35 microgram cubic meter, they have to do initial determination. If the exposure more than action level 75 and below permissible exposure limit is 150, so they have to do every 6 months. Then exposure more than permissible exposure limit, repeat monitoring quarterly. Quarterly, 3 months once. If the more than exposure permissible exposure level, which is 150 microgram, so they have to do 3 months once. Then additional monitoring if there is changes in the production and the process, control, or personnel. So which may result in new or additional exposure to the lead. So if there is changes in production, for example, they beginning they want to do this type of ceramic, then they change to the other production. They change to making plastic. So they have to do monitoring also. And then in terms of compliance, they have to do engineering control, ventilation. So ventilation is used, measurement which demonstrate the effectiveness of the system in controlling exposure shall be made at least every 3 months. So there must be a system in controlling exposure. For example, there is a guideline, guideline of there is a guideline. I will show you the engineering control. Okay, this guideline is talking about it's about ventilation. Ventilation. They call it guideline, design, inspection, testing, and examination of local exhaust ventilation. So in terms of engineering system, so they have to follow this guideline. So this guideline highlight the ventilation system, ventilation system, exhaust ventilation. So they have to follow lah. They have follow. For example, this you see the apa ni? This is the system of locus exhaust ventilation. There must be a fan, there is a fan, there is a air cleaner, there is a hood, and there is a ducting. So whenever they release the lead there must be hood to capture the lead and go to air cleaner, and the fan will release to the environment. So this is very important in terms of ventilation, exhaust ventilation. Um, this there is a system. They have to abide. They have to comply with the system. And then there is a work practice, including administrative control. Administrative control is the reducing employees' total weight average exposure to lead by establish and implement a job rotation schedule. So if the area is exposure is greatest exposure, they have to do job rotation schedule. They cannot work there 8 hours, for example, 4 hours, 2 hours. So they have to rotate. This is called administrative control. And methods of compliance, where engineering and work practice control do not reduce employee exposure to or below the permissible exposure level, the employer shall supplement this control with respirators. So there must be a PPE protection for the workers. They're using respirators. You can just now I highlight the video in the YouTube. There is a full application of respirators. They have to wear that their PPE. Yeah. And then respiratory protection being stipulated that respirators shall be used if during the time period necessary to install or implement engineering or practice control. So if they haven't installed the exhaust ventilation, exhaust ventilators, they have to do, they have to wear, they have to wear the PPE respirators. Yeah. So in work situation in which engineering and work practice control are not sufficient to reduce exposure to or below the PEL, so they have to use respirator. If they unable to do work engineering, unable to do administrative control work schedule, they have to use respirator. The employee shall ensure that the respirator issued to the employee exhibits minimum phase piece leakage, and that respirator is fitted properly. So every respirator there is a size, kan? Must be fitted to the individual. Some of the workers large size, small size, so must be fitted. The employer shall initiate a respiratory protection program. Uh, so they must have this program. For example, training, maintenance. They have to train the workers how to take care of the respirator, how to wear the respirator. And if an employee is exposed to lead above the permissible exposure limit, which is 150, if I'm not mistaken. If an employee is exposed to lead above the PEL without regard to the use of respirators or where the possibility of skin or eye irritation exists, the employer shall provide at no cost to the employee and ensure that the employees use appropriate protective work clothing and equipment such as but not limited to coveralls, overalls, or coveralls. Coverall is more complete daripada overall. Coveralls or similar full body work clothing. If the exposure level, exposure to lead above the PEL, they said they should give the worker coveralls or similar full body work clothing, gloves, hats, and shoes, or disposable shoe coverlets, and face shield, vented goggles, or other appropriate protective equipment approved by the DOSH. Eh? Uh, Similar like right now COVID-19, they use coverall, all that this thing, similar to the COVID-19. If they work, that dia punya PL is above, even though there is no skin or eye irritation, they have to employer have to use appropriate protective work clothing. Dia kena pakai clothing yang bukan untuk balik lah. Dia kena ada uniform special untuk dia. And then they have to do housekeeping. Housekeeping. So all surfaces in the factory shall be maintained as free as practicable from accumulation of leads. So floor or other surface where lead accumulates shall not be cleaned by the use of compressed air. Compressed air maksudnya apa? Dia tak boleh guna tembakkan angin. Angin tak boleh sebab lead ni akan terbang, akan terbang di udara. So they cannot use compressed air. They have to do housekeeping, but they cannot use compressed air. Showering, dry or wet sweeping and brushing may be used. You can use showering, dry or wet sweeping. You boleh sapu, you boleh sembuh air. Only where vacuum have been tried and found not to be effective. Sebelum you guna jurus air, wet sweeping, brushing, if the vacuum have been tried and found not to be effective. Vacuuming, sedut kandungan lead. Shower, bersihkan guna air. Where vacuum methods are selected, the vacuum shall be used and emptied in a manner which minimize the re-entry of lead into workplace. So you have to empty lah bila dia sedut kandungan lead tu, habuk lead tu, you have to empty, and then you kena cuci dan you kena simpan lah. Itu kalau boleh jangan dia terbang balik lagi di tempat kerja, workplace. And then in hygiene facilities and practice, there must be change rooms. Change room equipped with separate storage facilities for protective work clothing and equipment, and for street clothes which prevent cross contamination. So there must be drawer. So drawer ni bila sampai baju yang datang tempat kerja tu kena simpan, and then they use proper clothing, yang protective work clothing. Dia tak boleh bawa balik. Showers, they have to prepare. You have to sediakan showers. Who work in areas where their skin or clothing comes into contact with fume, dust, mist, or liquids containing lead, or where their airborne exposure to lead is above the PEL. So this person, dia punya clothing, dia pun kadang-kadang tangan dia ada terkena um, fume ke dust, mist or liquids, ada kandungan lead, they have to shower if the PL more than 150. And lunchroom, they have to isolate from lead process and readily accessible to employees. And then dia tak boleh lah lunchroom ni, kantin dekat dengan lead process ni, dan dia tak boleh tempat kerja tu buka pintu terus masuk dah boleh lunch, tak boleh. Dia kena mesti bangunan tu jauh daripada tu. Then they have to wash hands and face prior to eating, drinking, smoking or applying cosmetic. Kosmetik perempuan yang bekerja kat lab activity have to wash hand. And dia nak pakai kosmetik mesti jauh. Mesti jauh daripada tempat yang ada kandungan lead. And medical surveillance. Medical surveillance exposed above the action level for more than 30 days per year. You have to do medical surveillance. If you being exposed for more than 30 days, but the expose is above action level. Action level is berapa? 50. Your action level is, ingat ni, ini penting, kena ingat. Action level 75. 75 dia punya PL kali 2. Kalau action level dia working at action level more than 75, so they being exposed of more than 75 action level, they have to do medical surveillance. If they work 30 days per year and the action level above the action level, which is 75, permissible action level, we call it. And then in terms of medical surveillance, you see here, they have to do biological monitoring in the form of blood sampling and analysis for lead level to each employee as above. So they have to take a blood sample from every employee. If the lead, for lead level, so they measure dia punya lead level dalam kandungan darah tu. So at least every 6 months. Every 6 months they have to check. Dia ambil sampel darah. Dia kena buat analisis. Berapa kandungan lead tu dalam darah. At least every 3 months if a blood lead level at or above 40 microgram per 100 gram. So at least 3 months. 3 bulan if the lead level is above 40 microgram per 100. But less than 60 microgram per 100 gram whole blood. Between 40 to 60 microgram per 100 gram whole blood, they have to do at least one for 3 months. At least monthly, if a blood level above 60, but not less than 80. Between 60 and 80, they have to do at least per month. Once month one, 1 month once. They have to do. And then at least monthly during the removal period. If the doctor check, they have to remove from that place, they have to do monthly. At least monthly for a female employee or child bearing capacity. at least monthly for employee or childbearing capacity. Perempuan sebulan sekali, yang childbearing capacity. Childbearing capacity ialah mempunyai keupayaan untuk mengandung, kan? Mempunyai keupayaan untuk anak dara lah, anak dara perempuan, pekerja anak dara, sebulan sekali. Ini penting untuk medical surveillance. Medical examination at least annually for each employee whom a blood sampling test conducted at any time during the preceding 12 months indicate a blood lead level at or above 40 microgram per 100 gram. At least setahun sekali. Kalau blood level dia at or above 40 microgram per 100 gram, kena buat medical examination. Medical examination, cek darah, cek x-ray, keseluruhan lah, medical cek air kencing ke. So prior to assignment for each employee being assigned for the first time to an area which airborne concentration of lead are not above. So employee first time pun kena buat medical examination. Kalau dia first time buat kerja di situ, tak kira lah at above the action level or at as soon as possible upon notification by an employee, either the employee has developed sign or symptom. If the employee has the symptom, sign and symptom, commonly associated with lead intoxication, nausea, headache, dan sebagainya, sesak napas, sebagainya. That the employee desires medical advice concerning the effects of current or past exposure to lead on the employee ability to procreate a healthy child, or that employee has demonstrated difficulty in breathing during a respirator fitting test or while using a respirator. So kalau dia ada lead intoxication, nausea, pening kepala, mabuk, tak bermaya, lethargic dan sebagainya, ataupun dia ada masalah ketika nak pakai respirator, ada masalah pernafasan, so they have to kena buat medical examination, as medically appropriate for each employee, remove from exposure to lead due to a risk of sustaining material impairment to health. So that is, if there is employee being exposed, there is a risk, dia akan dapat balik penyakit itu, so dia kena remove. So the employee shall be removed, an employee from work having an exposure to lead at or above the action level, or each occasion that if the blood lead level more than 80 microgram per 100 gram of whole blood. So the employee shall remove. Dia tak boleh bagi employee itu bekerja di situ if dia punya blood level, lead level more than 80 microgram per 100 gram, or average of the last 3 blood sample test 73 microgram per 100. Dia buat test 3 kali, average dia more than 73, tak boleh. Then female employee of childbearing capacity more than 40 microgram per 100 gram. Female employee yang anak dara ni, childbearing capacity, dia 40 microgram per 100 gram, dia tak boleh bekerja dekat situ. Ya. Then the employer shall remove an employee from work having an exposure to lead or at or above the action level on each occasion that the result of a medical finding, determination or opinion show that the employee has a detected medical condition which places the employee at increased risk of material impairment to health from exposure to lead. So kalau doktor pandangan doktor bahawa dia ada risiko, dia pun kena remove. And the employee shall after notify of the fact that remove a pregnant employee and breastfeeding employee from work may expose the said employee to lead. So pregnant employee dia kena remove, employer kena keluarkan, tak boleh bekerja situ. And breastfeeding employee yang menyusukan anak pun tak boleh bekerja di kawasan. Then they have to do training program for all employees who are subjected to exposure to lead action level. And training program consists of this regulation, about this lead regulation. The employees' right, they have a right due to the punya, based on the punya content of lead dalam dia punya blood sample and the action level, PEL, permissible exposure level, they have to train. The specific nature of the operation, which could result in exposure to lead above the action level. So operation kadang-kadang terlebih akan menggunakan lead yang lebih, so they have to understand the nature of the operation. The purpose, proper selection, fitting use, and limitation of respirator. They have to they have to have knowledge of these respirators. And then they are talking about medical surveillance program, medical removal protection program. They have to understand that they have to understand their rights if they work at this lab. Then they have to put signs. Signs penting di depan pintu. Warning, lead work area poison, no smoking or eating. Record keeping. So at least 2 years. Monitoring record. Monitoring record ni is about the measure dia punya kandungan airborne concentration of the lead over that area. And then medical surveillance. Employee shall establish and maintain an accurate record for each employee. The examining registered medical practitioner shall establish and maintain an accurate record for each employee. Dia punya occupational health doctor have to have an accurate record. And all records shall be maintained for as long as the employee is being employed. Record dia kena simpan. Record as long as the employee being employed. Record dia kena simpan. Medical removal, the employee shall maintain each medical removal record for at least the duration of an employee employment. At least masa dia bekerja, yang dia kena remove tu, dia kena record. Remove from work area lah, bukan terminate from that work area, from that job. So the penalty, so any person who contravenes any provision of this regulation shall be guilty of an offence and shall, on conviction, be liable to a fine not exceeding 2,000. Ini regulation lama. Patutnya dia kena renew balik. Kena have a new version of this regulation sebab penalty dia only 2,000. Okay. So this talking about regulation, regulation of the act. So if you got time, I want you all to read. I will show you this uh, ventilation apa ni, exhaust ventilation guideline. So dia ada sistem. The system dia kena ada hood, dia kena enclosure head. Dalam hood ni dia ada macam kita masak. Contoh kita buat ada apa, mak saleh kat rumah tu ada bakar kayu. This untuk panas kan. Dia mesti ventilation, exhaust ventilation dia mesti bagus. Dia tujuan dia untuk ventilate dia punya apa, gas, lead punya concentration. Dia punya velocity, dia punya airflow, dia punya exterior pun ada velocity, dia punya flow rate, sebagainya, air distribution di mana, so dia punya saluran ducting dia pun dia ada dia punya diameter dia, ducting system dia, air cleaner dia macam mana, so dia kena ada filter, dia tak boleh just release into the environment, environment terus apa ni release the gas, tak boleh. Ini dia punya fans, example of the fans. Fans dia bukan sembarangan fan, ini yang canggih punya fans. Dia boleh circulate dia punya airflow tu, dia punya flow rate berapa, you all boleh baca ni lah. Kalau you terlibat dalam OSHA ni, anemometer ni lebih kepada kelajuan angin kat sini, phase velocity dia, pun diambil ke maintenance, record keeping, so ada kat sini. So dalam sini pun ada cerita tentang inspection, apa inspection yang patut buat, testing dekat local exhaust ventilation. Okay, and then dalam regulation ni you boleh baca, if you got time read. I dah simplified kan regulation, but if you want to find more detail about the regulation, you can read this regulation 1984, dia punya permissible exposure limit, tapi I dah simplify kan dalam slide ni, tak payah baca ni, ingat saja. Alright. Okay, untuk itu sampai di sini sajalah lecture Battery and Machinery Act Lead Regulation 1984. Kalau ada soalan dan pertanyaan boleh PM me ataupun WhatsApp, ataupun next class kalau kita jumpa boleh tanya. Okay, sekian, terima kasih. Stay home, stay safe and enjoy your study.